All right. The next story we have up here is a real update for something we've talked about quite a bit, and that is the UN arms embargo for Iran. This is something that the past month and a half that we've been doing the show has been a big topic for the U.S. government, as they've been doing everything they can to try to get the UN to extend the arms embargo against Iran, although coming up short. And so, Pompeo has just been resulting to threats and, saying that we'll sanction anybody who sells the arms to Iran, despite the fact that the actual UN embargo is ending. Well, the embargo has now officially ended, and Pompeo has restated his threats, and it's going to create a situation, I assume, where in the near future, Russia or China will at least sign the preliminary, parts of an arms deal with Iran. Not that, they're going to have brand new Russian fighter planes by the end of the month or S-400 missile systems. These, deals often take a long time to get done. And so who knows when Iran would actually get any weapons, but the first headlines we'll start to see will, I'm sure, come out in the next again few months, sometime by maybe 2021. We'll start to see Iran signing deals with Russia potentially for like a S-400 missile system, or with China for their anti-ship missiles that they find very effective against like U.S. aircraft carriers and stuff like that. Um, yeah. So, Will, what do you think about this one?
Yeah, I mean, like this is interesting. This embargo finally expired on Sunday. I think after it being enforced for like 13 years, and after all that drama with the U.S. and their demands in the Security Council and the failed votes and their open threats and all this stuff, it looks like it happened pretty uneventfully. And like the only one really still complaining about this is the U.S. Like the rest of the world has pretty much accepted that this arms embargo has expired. And just listeners may be familiar with this, but I think it's useful to run back over this. So the UN had slapped Iran with this embargo over a decade ago, but the nuclear deal that was signed between Iran and world powers back in 2015 had this provision that would sunset the embargo after 5 years, assuming that the deal held and everything. And that is what just happened on Sunday. That it finally embargo expired. However, the deal also had this. It also, it also lifted a series of UN sanctions that were previously imposed on Iran. However, any of the signatories to the nuclear deal were allowed to request what's called a snapback of both the sanctions and the arms embargo if they found that Iran was non-compliant with the agreement, or they thought that they were. So the U.S. first tried to extend just the arms embargo part separately back in August in the UN Security Council, and they were trying to extend it basically in perpetuity, like just indefinitely into the future. But that failed. The council rejected that pretty overwhelmingly. I think you only had two member states voting for that, the U.S. being one of them, of course, the other one being the Dominican Republic. But it was after this attempt to extend the embargo, that Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, said he would then invoke the what's called the snapback mechanism of the nuclear deal. However, that also failed completely miserably. The Security Council refused to even put that up for a vote. They just like left it on the table. I think 13 out of 15 member states just said like, nah, like we're not really interested in this. Including all five other signatories to the nuclear deal itself, the UK and France and Germany and Russia and China. And they had been arguing that, like, the U.S. already pulled itself out of the nuclear deal in 2018. It violated all of its terms by bringing back all of its own unilateral sanctions on Iran. So they said you can't just like waltz back in and start arbitrarily invoking parts of the deal just to hit Iran with. Um, and since then, the U.S. has kind of just been pouting and like, insisting that the snapback thing actually is in force, like without a UN vote, just because they say so, I guess. But like with an international sanctions regime and a international arms embargo, you kind of need other countries to participate. Otherwise, this is just like more unilateral U.S. action, which the U.S. has already done plenty of. So that's basically been the situation since that failed UN vote. The U.S. is just like pouting and screaming and crying and saying like, no, the embargo is on Iran, and we'll still say like they are threatening people with sanctions. Anyone who does any arms business with the Iranians. But I mean, it doesn't appear that the U.S. did get its way here. I mean, there is no more embargo; it's gone, and the snapback sanctions are not in force, according to all the countries that matter. Um, and the big thing that, like you kind of hinted at this, but the big thing that Pompeo and U.S. officials have been going crazy over and sounding alarms about is the possibility that Iran will start buying like advanced weapon systems from Russia or China without that embargo in place. But first of all, I just think like it's a bit rich for the U.S. to be complaining about another country arming itself when Iran would be mostly arming itself as a means to defend itself from the U.S. Or maybe the Israelis, I guess, who are themselves bankrolled by the Americans, by American tax dollars, and supported in every way by U.S. policy. But it's like the U.S. is basically complaining that Iran wants weapons to protect itself from its own threats, from the U.S.'s own threats. Like how dare they do that? No country is allowed to defend itself from American aggression. The thing is, though, the Iranians claim they do not want to start buying weapons. They're maintaining that they would actually rather start selling them to other countries. And that is not, as far as like, I think the U.S. has threatened a sanction for them even selling weapons. But the big concern is that the Iranians would get some advanced, sophisticated weapon systems from our, dire adversaries, Russia and China. However, another thing too is that like these arms sales, like they may eventually happen. The Russians and Chinese may eventually decide they do want to sell weapons to Iran, but it's not totally clear that those would happen right away. Like the Russians all along, even when the embargo was enforced, they argued that the embargo did not cover defensive weapons. So the Russians actually already sold the Iranians their S-300 missile defense system back in, I think, 2015. And they could have tried to do that same thing with the S-400, make that same argument, but for whatever reason, they didn't. And so I don't know, maybe their whole equation kind of changed now that the embargo has expired, but it seems like there's some indication the Russians aren't super eager to start hawking a ton of weapons to Iran immediately, because they kind of had some opportunity to do that with some of their sophisticated missile defense systems, and they did not do that with the S-400. Then there's also the fact that the Iranians are having pretty like severe economic hardship, which itself might kind of put a limit on their capabilities to do a gigantic arms deal with Russia or China. Not to mention the U.S. sanctions that are already on them make it pretty hard for them to pay for anything overseas. Just like the financial transactions themselves are blocked. So, like there are some obstacles it seems in front of any kind of major arms deals right away between Iran and other world powers. And of course, as I'm saying, the U.S. has also threatened additional sanctions for anyone who does buy or sell weapons from Iran. So there's that as well. So like it just seems like there are quite a few roadblocks up in front of Iran immediately getting like a huge arsenal of Russian weapons or something. It seems the U.S. has like very much overblown that concern.
Yeah. I mean, the two things that really stand out to me are one, just the failure of Trump's Iran policy that actually I'm going to talk about a little bit more, I think, in the next story. And then the other one that, of course, as you mentioned, Iran is struggling economically right now. As far as countries that have been, suffering from COVID, it seems that Iran is one of those that has like a perpetual like 150 to 200 people dying a day, which are some odd, statistics. If you look at the graphs for Iran, it's some different looking numbers. But it does represent a country that has struggled with COVID for months and months and months and shut down different aspects and places in their country and stuff like that. So that's been harmful. I also believe the next Iranian presidential election is coming up next year. And so, I'm guessing for all parties involved, if you're spending, millions, hundreds of millions or billions on weapons, from Russia or China or something like that, maybe that's not the like good electoral politics in Iran leading up to the election where, people are struggling to eat. It may be that the Iranian people are looking for a government that's more likely to, I think, invest a little bit more in people than weapons or something like that at this time. And again, with leading up to a presidential election, politics are even more important than normal, and so it may push off any major Iranian weapons buys deeper into 2021 or who knows how far into the future. But I gotta move on to